Hello, everyone, and welcome to this ESCoE seminar. Tonight we've got, tonight Australia time, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. We've got a great talk arranged from Ryan Decker. We have Tom Wickersham from the ONS as discussant, and we're going to have some time for a Q&A as well. But first, I should just note who I am. I'm Kevin Fox. I'm chairing this webinar. I'm at UNSW Sydney and ESCoE. I'm not in Sydney at the moment. I'm actually in Dirigen land, part of the UN nation. Pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and note that learning and knowledge transfer has taken place on these lands for millennia, and I'm glad to be part of that tradition today. So I'm just going to pass over to Ryan in a minute, but would like to just say again, we've got a Q&A at the end. The way to be involved in that Q&A is to put your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom. You'll find it down the bottom of your screen. Put your question there, and if I see it, I will ask you to unmute and ask your question. So please, during the talk, feel free at any time to put your comments and questions into the Q&A. So we have Ryan Decker from the US Federal Reserve, and he's going to be presenting to us on this fascinating issue of surging business formation in the pandemic. So over to you, Ryan.
Okay, thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for joining. This is joint work with John Haltwanger, and we're looking at surging business formation in the pandemic. And I'll emphasize that this is for the US. And so it's a US focused paper. And we'll hear from Tom a little bit about the UK. I'll emphasize the disclaimer at the bottom of my slide there, which is that any of my comments today in my presentation or the Q&A are just my opinions and don't necessarily represent the views of the Federal Reserve Board, staff, or system. And let me get started. So we saw a surge in applications for new businesses in the US during the pandemic. And so I'm showing here a few lines. The black line is the total number of applications for new employer identification numbers. And then I have a couple other lines that I'll mention. These are published as part of the Business Formation Statistics, which is a Census Bureau product that uses data from the IRS, the US Tax Authority. So they collect applications for new EINs. Suppose you're thinking about starting a business, and maybe you're going to be a corporation, maybe you'll be a partnership. You'll need an EIN in the United States. And some sole proprietorships will need an EIN too if they're going to hire employees, and they might choose to do so for other reasons. The Census Bureau gets these data. They throw out what we might call non-businesses, trusts, estates, financial instruments, and so on. And then everything else shows up in the black line here. And as you can see, there was an initial dip at the beginning of the pandemic, but then these applications spiked to their highest level on record by a long shot in July of 2020. You can kind of see them sort of easing down throughout the rest of 2020, but then they jumped again and they've been very high throughout the pandemic. I'm also showing a couple other lines here. I have a green line. We call those likely employer applications. So this is a subset of all the applications that have one or more characteristics that tend to be predictive of actual employer firm birth. And this is an important point that I'll come back to, which is that these are just applications. These are sort of intentions to start a business. Whether they'll actually turn into a business that is employing people is unclear at the time of application. But the green line are those that tend to have a little higher propensity to turn into employer businesses. And so, as I said, in the pandemic, we see this initial spike. There's this first wave where they get very high in mid-2020, and they sort of ease down throughout that year. And then in 2021, they rise again, and they've been very high ever since then. And I think one thing that was particularly striking and surprising here is that the likely employer series rose alongside the likely non-employer series. And why is that surprising? Well, we can imagine reasons that non-employers, very, very small businesses where it's just sort of a sole proprietor without employees, we can imagine why those might rise in a recessionary environment. When the labor market's very weak, people might go out and need to start businesses just to get income for themselves. And indeed, in the last recession, depending on how you measure it, non-employer activity was either flat or moved up a little bit. So that part's not so surprising, but the likely employers part is quite surprising. Historically, employer business formation in the US has been pro-cyclical. It falls during recessions. And so seeing this number go up so much in the pandemic was a big surprise. And let me try to push a little more on this. And so here I'm showing again, the green line is the likely employer application series. There's typically a lag between application and employer birth, employer firm birth, even conditional on becoming an employer firm. And so the BFS product from the Census Bureau features a series that is actual firm births. That's the solid black line on this chart. And they do that by linking their applications to actual employer business formations in Census Bureau microdata, the longitudinal business database some of you may have heard about for the US. They can link to that and they can see which applications actually transition into employer firms within 4 or 8 quarters. I'm showing the 8-quarter series here. And so that's the solid black line. But those data on actual employer firms in the Census Bureau Business Register lag by quite a ways, by a few years. And so they end, and here I'm showing them ending, I think, at the end of 2018, because this is an 8-quarter series. And after that, they provide a predicted firm births series. And so this is where they can look at all the characteristics of the application, and they can use a predictive model. So they're not just looking at a subset of applications as in the likely employer series, but rather they're predicting based on all the characteristics of the application, whether you're going to turn into a firm, an employer firm, within 4 or 8 quarters. And so that series is shown in the dashed or dotted black line. And so this can be quite helpful for thinking about the likelihood for firms to actually turn into employers, or sorry, for applications to turn into employers. And here, just to note the pandemic pattern, and it's probably hard to see, I should have drawn out the chart a little bit better. The green line, which is the application series, jumps early in the pandemic by quite a bit more than the black line, the prediction firm birth series. And so that first wave, it looks like the predicted births is a bit lower than the applications, although still obviously extremely high. And then in that sort of second wave that starts in 2021, the two series kind of move together. And so we might look at that and say, wow, there will be this huge surge in employer business formation. But people still had a lot of doubts. As I said, it's very odd for employer entry to go up in a recessionary environment. Additionally, there were lots of concerns that the pandemic is just a very strange environment, and it might be that these transition rates and that these predictive models, that they're going to change in the pandemic. And maybe we shouldn't expect these applications to turn into genuine employer businesses at rates similar to what we've seen in the past. And so as this surge was occurring during 2020, 2021, 2022, there's been a fair number of skeptics wondering, oh, is this for real? Or is this, people, they were work from home for a while, they got bored, maybe some folks who lost their jobs were scrambling, and they're filing these applications and they aren't actually going to follow up and start a new employer firm. And so this has been sort of an ongoing question for a while. And we set out to write this paper to try to give some insights into whether these applications really meant there'd be a surge in business entry. And we do have enough data now, and that's what I'm going to describe in the paper, to conclude there was indeed a surge in genuine employer firm and establishment, employer business formation in the pandemic. And so I'm showing a few lines to illustrate that here. On this chart, the green line is again the application series, that's the likely employer application series. The orange line here is from a Bureau of Labor Statistics product called the Business Employment Dynamics, and it tells us quarterly establishment births. And we have those data now through the first quarter of this year. And so as you can see from the orange line, that number really surged, and it looks like it might be coming down. This is expressed as a rate of total establishments. The actual level hasn't come down quite as much as that line, but it's still very elevated in any case. And so these are actual establishments that have hired employees, formal employees, and that number really surged. And the pickup started in the second quarter of 2021. So it was a bit lagged, and as I mentioned, there is a lag typically, but 2021 seems to be where we really see this pickup. Now, a data definition issue is a little bit important here, which is that in US statistical agency parlance, an establishment is a single operating location of a business. So a new establishment could be a brand new firm, or it could be a new 7-Eleven location or something like that. And so you get both things in the establishment birth series. And What we might be a little more interested in, particularly if we're thinking about entrepreneurship, is firm births. And so the black line there is a series that is annual firm births. And so the annual firm dynamics data sets in the US have a March reference timing. And so we have those data through March of 2022. And if you look at that black line, there's that big tick up there on the right side of the chart. And that is the year ending in March of 2022. And so indeed, we do see this big pickup. And if you think a little bit about the timing, the establishment births pick up starting in the second quarter of 2021, and that would fall under that year ending March 2022 that we're seeing in the firm birth data. So the firm birth data are a bit more lagged, but as far as they go, we are seeing this pickup. And I think we'll get another year of data maybe next month on those. So it does look like there's some signs of pickup in employer business formation in the pandemic. I'm going to get into a little more about the data infrastructure, which is an important part of the paper. But here's what we're going to do. In this paper, we're using public use data from various sources. And so these are all data that can be downloaded from statistical agency websites in the US. We're going to try to characterize the surge in business applications and employer entry, particularly in terms of big pandemic themes about geographic restructuring, restructuring across industries, things like work from home, and also what has been called the Great Resignation, which is that in the US, at least, we saw this huge surge in the rate at which workers were quitting their jobs in the pandemic. And so people called that the Great Resignation. And we're going to try to relate this business formation surge to the Great Resignation as well. And then finally, we're going to comment a little bit on what has been called declining business dynamism. And that is in the few decades prior to the pandemic, there had been a trend decline in various measures of business dynamism, firm entry rates, job reallocation rates, worker reallocation rates, and other things. And this jump in business formation we're seeing in the pandemic is kind of striking given the longer run trend. And so we're going to talk about, well, what does this all mean for declining dynamism? So that's what we'll do in the paper. Let me first try to talk a little bit about the data here. I think we have a measurement-oriented crowd here. I think that one contribution of the paper is that we pulled from a lot of different data sets. What we find is that no single publicly available data set really lets us characterize what we think is a comprehensive picture of employer business formation in the pandemic. You know, we'd like to zoom in on geography and industry. We'd like to have certain measurement concepts. But what we find is that there's lots of very nice public use data sets out there for the US. And if you take them together, they each have some advantages in terms of either timeliness, frequency, maybe measurement concept, maybe how detailed they can go in terms of geography or industry. And so we try to piece together the story from lots of different data sources. We think that we can actually do quite a lot with what's out there without even having access to a lot of confidential microdata just yet. So let me just highlight the main data sources we'll use here. The first is the one I started with, the business formation statistics. And this is a relatively young product. This recession was its first big test. And this product was rolled out, I think, maybe in 2018 or so by the Census Bureau. And what they are doing is they're getting, as I said, they're publishing monthly employer identification number applications. So the tax authority, the IRS, sends those over to the Census Bureau. Actually, I think they get them weekly, and they do publish a weekly series as well online. We're not really using that in this paper. We're using the monthly data mainly. So they get these data. They throw out the non-businesses, trusts, estates, and so on. And then they publish this on the website. And this is the most timely read on business entry or prospective business entry that we have in the United States. We get these data shortly after the end of the month. And the slides I'll present today have data through September. I think the October data will be out soon, or maybe might have just come out. I don't have them. But we've got data through September for this series. It was a huge improvement on what existed before in terms of business formation measurement, in terms of timeliness. So we get these data very, very quickly. There's quite a few really interesting series that are published as part of the BFS. We're going to focus on just a few of them. First is, as I said, we have this series that we call the Likely Employer series. If you go get the BFS data, they call them high propensity applications, or HBA. So these are applications with characteristics that are predictive of employer business. I want to emphasize this isn't like a model-based estimate. Rather, it's a subset of all the applications. where that subset is defined based on certain characteristics. And so if you have one or more of these characteristics, we'll put you in the subset. So certain industries qualify, certain legal forms of organization, whether or not you indicate that you have planned wages, things like that. So that's the likely employer series. That'd be our preferred series to sort of think about in the pandemic. It's a very straightforward thing, just the number of applications, but it doesn't always give us what we want. We will also study the total application series, which allows us to really zoom in on geography. We can get to the county level in the US and industry. So we can get down to 3-digit NAICS, that's our North American industry codes, with the total application series. And so that's very, very helpful. We find when we look across states and sectors where it's possible to compare these two measures, that likely employers and total applications do move together in the pandemic. And so we feel reasonably comfortable looking at total applications when we zoom in. And then the other series that I'll show in a few spots is this projected firm births series. So that is a model-based forecast of, for a given set of applications, how many of them will transition into employer firms within 4 or 8 quarters. They provide both series. So I'm going to look at those a little bit too, because they have some really interesting value added in the pandemic as well. That's the BFS. Let me also mention the business employment dynamics. This is a BLS product. We have 3 or more statistical agencies in the US. The Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes this product, and it is based on administrative data from the unemployment insurance system. And so in the US, the states manage unemployment insurance. They provide records to the BLS, and they publish this as part of the business employment dynamics. And what they're going to give us are quarterly data, and they'll give us establishment births. Now, as I said, an establishment is a single operating location of a business. Could be a new firm, could be a new location for Starbucks or something. So they'll give us quarterly establishment births. They also give us openings, which includes births, but also reopenings of establishments that might have closed within the last year. So seasonal businesses that close and reopen, they'll count as openings. Usually we'll prefer to look at establishment births, but again, there will be places where we can zoom in more on detailed things if we look at total openings. And so we'll look at both. And those data currently extend through the first quarter of this year. So we get those data 2 to 3 quarters after the fact. These are based on high quality administrative data. They also have an annual product that will give us firm births. And so again, there's some subtle measurement things here. In BLS data, a firm is defined as an EIN, one of these employer identification numbers, and they can give us births of employer firms with that measure. And they give us those through March of 2022. Now, a few of you might be really measurement geeks and notice that there's some firm definition issues here. The Census Bureau in the US defines firms a little more broadly because some firms can have multiple EINs. And for that reason, we sometimes prefer to look at firm births in Census Bureau data, but those data lag by much more. It turns out that this EIN-based firm birth series from the BED tracks the alternative measures from the Census Bureau very, very closely historically. Probably more than most people wanted to know, but some of you probably wanted me to cover that. The next one here is the quarterly census of employment and wages, the QCW. This is based on the same UI records as the BED. And what you get in these is you get quarterly counts of establishments, how many employer establishments. And there's some subtle things there. Sometimes establishments that don't have any employees will stick around in there, but it's mostly focused on employer establishments. So we can't see gross establishment births in this product, but we can see net establishment births. Because we can see the change in the number of establishments. And here we can really zoom in on geography and industry. The QCW is a great product where you can go down to very detailed industry. You can go down to the county level. So that'll be useful there too. The quarterly workforce indicators, QWI, this is a Census Bureau product. It's actually based on the same administrative UI records as the BED and the QCW, but they're able to link in with Census Bureau records on firm identifiers and things. Here we're going to get quarterly job and worker flows. So I mentioned we're going to try to talk about the Great Resignation, the surge in quits. You need worker flow data for that. And so we'll be able to do that to a reasonable extent in the QWI. This is a data product that's put on the census website state by state. We're using a balanced panel of 45 states. That covers the vast majority of US economic activity. And we have these data through the second quarter of last year. And then finally, I'll mention the JOLTS, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. This is the sort of monthly headline data product for the US that tells us how many quits and layoffs and hires and total separations there were in the US. And so that's monthly, and we'll use that to look at quits. And then there's some other data sets I mentioned here, but the main ones are those in bold. So I highlight those just to say, if you're thinking about studying business dynamics in the US, you have a lot of options. And so you should think about these different data sources, and we provide more detail about them in the appendix of the paper. Okay, let me move on and talk a little bit about aggregate patterns that we see in the pandemic. I'll just sort of characterize some of the key things that happened in the aggregate, and then I'll start zooming in on industry and geography. So the chart on the top left here is looking at annual growth in the number of units in several of these different data sources that I've just mentioned. Okay, so again, annual business dynamics data in the US are tied to March. And so these will be growth from March to March. And it's just the percent growth in the number of units, either firms or establishments. And we've got a few data sets here. You can see they tend to move together historically. But what you'll see there, especially if you look at 2022, so that's the year ending in March of 2022, and then we also have a 2023 observation for the QCW, we see these very high, even record growth rates in the number of business units operating in the United States. And so these are very big numbers, and we're seeing it through the most recent data we can see in the first quarter of this year from the QCW there. So this is an enormous thing. This is a big increase in the number of businesses. These bottom panels here have a little bit of repeat, but let me walk through them. The left panel is showing that likely employer application series again. You can see it in a little more detail. You can see that 2020 pattern, and then you can see what's happened since. The middle panel in green is showing you the number of establishment births through the first quarter of this year. So you can see this huge jump. And I've also thrown in the number of exits or deaths. And you can see the spike early in the pandemic, and then deaths or exits were quite subdued for a while. This was kind of a surprise relative to what people might have feared in the spring of 2020. I will just mention there's this huge jump in the latest data there. The exit data lag a little bit because they want to make sure that you don't reopen before they'll call you an exit. But those are the latest data. Those are the second quarter of 2022, if you see that big spike at the end. And I'm not sure what's going on there. That's a very large spike. It's possible these data could still revise. But for now, I don't have a story there. But I think it's useful to see the exit numbers relative to the birth numbers so you can just see the net increase in the number of businesses. The far right panel is showing exits and births in terms of employment. So the jobs associated with the births or the exits. And so you see this big increase in the jobs created by establishment births. These have been averaging 1 million jobs per quarter since the second quarter of 2021, which is just an enormous number of jobs to be created every quarter by these births. You'll also notice, if you kind of compare the middle panel and the right panel, that the jump in the number of establishments being born is bigger than the jump in the jobs being created by those establishments being born. And so that suggests, and indeed it'll be true, that the average size of these new units came down a little bit during the pandemic. And you can see that here where I'm looking at firm birth size. On the left panel, we're just literally looking at the average size in employees of a new firm. And I've got the BDS data, which are a year behind, and the BED data. And you can see this little step down there at the end. So the entrants we got were a bit smaller than average. There's a little bit of nuance here, though, because on the right panel, I take the average birth size and I divide it by the average incumbent firm size. And you actually don't see such a discrete jump or drop in the blue line there. You sort of see it staying on trend. So all firms got smaller in the pandemic, not just the new firms. And so that's sort of a puzzle to think about. Probably you want to think about it in terms of, well, what happened to overall employment and things. But sometimes people build models where average firm size means something. Okay, let me move on to industry patterns. So here I'm going to zoom in on 3-digit industry codes. Okay, so these aren't very big, like the big broad sectors, but the next level down. And I'm going to focus on the top 5 industries for the increase in business applications. And here to go to the 3-digit level, I've got to use total applications, not the likely employer series. And so we think these industries help tell pandemic stories. So for example, in blue, you see the non-store retailers. And so obviously there's a huge surge in demand for online retail, and that's online retail is in that industry among some other things. And so that has this enormous spike, especially early on in the pandemic. Interestingly, it has sort of eased down or trended down throughout the pandemic, even though it still remains elevated. Let me also skip to the black line, personal and laundry services, things like pet care. So if you think about the blue line and the black line, you could be thinking about industries that help people do their work from home lifestyle, if they're able to do that. And that makes sense from a pandemic storytelling perspective. But look also at the red line, professional, scientific, and technical services. That jumps up early in the pandemic and has actually stayed quite elevated throughout, through the end of this series, which is the end of 2022, I think. My axes labels are a little off. This includes things like architectural design, computer systems design, R&D. These are businesses that help other businesses with technical change. And so we're not just seeing, oh, let's help people work at home in their sweatpants. We're also seeing big technical change industries that are seeing an increase in business formation activity. We also see some other things in administrative and support services that are services that help other businesses. And then truck transportation. We had these big stories about freight market issues in the pandemic, supply chain challenges. You also need trucks to drive stuff to people's homes if they're ordering all their stuff online. So you see an increase there. And interestingly, that one actually sort of peaks a year or so into the pandemic and then eases down. When we look at these industries, we think these are industries that are conducive to pandemic work, lifestyle, and business. So they sort of helped with the transitions that individuals, households, and businesses went through in the pandemic. And this was the first clue early on that the surge in applications could have genuine economic content. The industry patterns made sense given what we knew about changes in the pandemic economy, changes in patterns of consumer demand, and the way businesses do things. This was sort of the first clue. I'm now going to zoom out a little bit and look at broad sector. And this is going to allow me to look at the likely employer applications series and one of the prediction series that I mentioned earlier. And this is going to help me illustrate, I think, an important point here. So the panel on the left there is the likely employer applications by broad sector. And you see some interesting patterns here. You can note sort of the relative levels. This is broad sector, not 3-digit like on the prior chart. But the thing that you've all noticed already is the retail trade line has this huge jump at the end. That's the latest month. That's September. We saw this huge jump in retail trade. And this is a nice way to illustrate some of the challenges with administrative data. We don't know exactly what happened here, but it's possible that there was a law change in the United States called the Inform Act that required third-party sellers on online marketplaces to provide more information about themselves. And in practice, this meant that many of them needed to get an EIN. And so that's our best guess of what's going on anyways. And we see this jump in EIN applications in the retail trade sector where those online retail folks are in the latest data here. And so this can be a challenge. Administrative data can be quite noisy, but the panel on the right illustrates the value of the BFS product, the business formation statistics product overall, because this one shows our predicted firm births series, where it's using historical microdata to predict going forward how many of these applications will convert into actual employer firms. And that chart covers the same time period as the chart on the left. And as you see, there is no jump in the retail industry in the latest month. So the predicted series was not fooled. The predicted series saw through that noise and suggests that it's quite valuable for seeing through some of these challenges that can arise in a product like the BFS. You can also notice, by the way, the other reason I show this is in the predicted series, the ordering of which industries were most important is a little bit different. In particular, these tech industries are the highest. Of course, that's partly a function of industry feeding into that model. But it's sort of reassuring or an optimistic view about what's going on that the predictive series here expects lots of business formation in tech-related sectors. Now, I was just showing you applications. The paper is also about employer business entry. So let me show you how this all translates into actual employer entry. So I'm going to get the firm birth data, annual data through March of 2022 from the BED, the BLS product that I mentioned, and focus on the scatter plot on the left here, where I'm plotting the increase, the surge in firm births on the y-axis. So I'm looking at the pandemic pace of firm births minus the pre-pandemic average pace. Okay, so how much did the pace of firm births increase in the pandemic? That's on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, I've got business applications, in this case, likely employer business applications. And then I've drawn a 45-degree line on here. So a sector that lands on the 45-degree line is a sector that saw the same surge in firm births as it did in business applications. And you can see most sectors are on the line. And this is why we say it does appear that the applications have turned into genuine employer businesses. Most sectors are on the line. Information's a little above the line, which is interesting. But you'll also note some important sectors that are not even close. So for example, if you look at retail trade in that panel on the left, it saw a much bigger surge in business applications than in actual firm births. Again, the predictive model is going to be valuable here. So the panel on the right does the same thing using the predicted firm birth series. And as you can see, the retail trade sector gets closer to the line there. So again, the prediction series is sort of seeing through. But the overall takeaway from these charts, and we think of this in a few other ways. We can zoom into the 3-digit level if we're willing to use slightly less ideal measurement concepts. We get similar correlations. We can do this for establishment births, similar. The story here is the patterns of business entry in the pandemic are similar for employer business entry as for applications. And they help us illustrate big pandemic themes. Let me now turn to geography for a moment. So focus on the map on the left here. These are US states. And here I'm showing at the state level, the surge in likely employer business applications per capita. Again, it's the pandemic pace compared to the pre-pandemic pace. So where did we see a big increase in the pace of likely employer applications? And I want to emphasize it's on a per capita basis. So we're not just picking up population flows here. So we see some interesting geographic restructuring here. We see lots of applications in the South. We think that's a story that needs to be told. We don't have the story for that in this paper, but there's something interesting going on in the South, especially Georgia, this huge increase in business applications per capita. And then we see much lower increases in some other states. So there's this restructuring across geography in the US. We also observe it within cities. So the map on the right is showing you New York City. So New York City metro area, I'm showing you the counties of New York City. And again, I should have mentioned, darker blue means a bigger increase. And what you see, if you look there, it's hard to read it, but I labeled Manhattan there. Manhattan, downtown New York City, sees a relatively small surge in business applications. And then outer areas, outerlying areas or suburbs see a bigger surge. So we see what might be called like a donut effect within cities. And we observe this in lots of cities. We also use some models. We run some regressions, nonlinear regressions, where we relate the within city surge in applications nonlinearly, in a nonlinear fashion, to population density, establishment density, and changes in work from home. And we find these interesting relationships. We find that where people went to work from home is where these applications surge. And so this is this sort of movement of business activity out of downtown areas and into the suburbs. So we see this restructuring across geography. And once again, we see across geography that the employer business formation patterns are similar to the application patterns. So the scatter plot on the left, it's a bin scatter where I'm looking at counties of the US. So there's something like 3,000 counties in the US. And the y-axis is showing you the surge in establishments per capita from the QCW data. And I'm comparing that to the surge in total business applications per capita. And we see this positive, very statistically significant relationship. So in other words, the places where the applications are happening is the places where the employer establishments are being formed. And then the chart on the right, or the map on the right, is showing you the map of New York City again. And this time it's for the increase in establishments per capita. And the patterns aren't exactly identical, but they're broadly similar in that we're seeing less increase in downtown areas than we are in outer areas of the city. So geography, as was the case with industry, shows us similar patterns in the employer business formation data and the business application data. And again, we see these pandemic stories, the shift from downtown areas to outer areas as businesses are moving to service work from home workers and things like that. Okay, let me now turn to the Great Resignation. This is the surge in the rate at which workers have been quitting their jobs in the pandemic. So this is a busy chart, but I think it's quite instructive. In green, I'm showing you the likely employer business applications series again. And in orange, I'm showing you our BED establishment births series quarterly data through the first quarter of this year. The purple dotted line is the quit rate. That's from the JOLTS data that I mentioned. And if you look at that purple dotted line, you can see the Great Resignation, as a lot of folks have called it, the surge in quit rates in the US. It has come down some, of course, but it was very, very elevated for a time. So you can see that in the time series, these things sort of move together. We'd like to do a little cross-sectional analysis to really solidify the patterns. So we'll do that. One challenge is that the quits data from JOLTS aren't available at a super detailed level, so they're available at the state level, not at the county level. So for county level investigations, we're going to use a proxy for quits. That's the red line, excess separations from the QWI data that I mentioned. So what's an excess separation? Well, a worker separates from a firm, but the firm does not destroy that job. They refill the job. Those are often going to be a job-to-job separation. And so I showed job-to-job separations from, this is from a product called J2J at the Census Bureau, that's in blue. Excess separations tend to be job-to-job separations. And those are often quits. And that in the literature before, this has been used as a proxy for quits. And they often will be. So we can get excess separations from QWI data at the county level. And that's why I'm bringing this up as a proxy. So I'm going to look at quits and excess separations and compare them to our business formation measures in the cross-section. I'll start with quits from the JOLTS data, where I can look at the state level. And so focus on the scatter plot on the left here, where we're looking at the increase in the quit rate at the state level and comparing it to the increase in business applications. This is likely employer business applications per capita. And we see this positive statistically significant relationship where the places that saw a big increase in quits also saw a big increase in business applications per capita. I'm also showing you something on the right panel that I think could be useful. That's the layoff rate, okay? The layoff rate does not have this strong positive relationship with business applications per capita. Why do I show you that? Well, one potential story for the surge in business applications is, we sort of know that when labor markets are very bad, that can cause people to engage in entrepreneurship of necessity to go and get money. So you might think, oh, well, all this business formation is because people lost their jobs. It turns out we don't see that relationship in the data, at least here at the state level. And in any case, in the US, the layoff surge that we had was very, very short-lived in 2020. And layoffs have been quite subdued since the middle of 2020. So we're not seeing that relationship. Now let me turn to the county level, where I'll use my proxies from the QWI. So this panel on the left here is showing you the excess separation rate. This is a bin scatter plot of all the counties where we have these data. And then I'm comparing it to total business applications per capita. And here we see a positive and very statistically significant relationship between this proxy for quits and applications at the county level. On the right panel, I'm showing you the job destruction rate. I'm thinking of that as a proxy for layoffs so that I can observe it at the county level. Actually, here we see a positive relationship. It's a much weaker positive relationship than what we're seeing for excess separations. So what do we think happened? Well, it could be anything. We're not doing causal inference here, but a likely story is that many workers that were quitting their jobs joined a new business or started a new business. So they flowed to new businesses either as employees or entrepreneurs. That seems plausible given the patterns that we're seeing. And the much less likely story is that the surge in business formation is explained by layoffs and the weak labor market. We don't see as good of evidence for that particular story. Okay, the final topic that I'll cover here is about this long-term trends in declining dynamism that happened before the pandemic in the US. And do we think it's over? Are we back in some sense? So here's a couple charts just to illustrate some elements of that. Here I'm showing the share of firms that are new firms on the left. So that's the startup rate. I can see I didn't label it. It's the share of firms that are new firms on the left panel. And then on the right panel, it's the share of employment that is at new firms. And these have been in a long, a multi-decade secular decline in a couple of data sources. And there's lots of literature on this. John, my co-author, and I have published lots of papers, and other people have looked at this. And I know there's a lot of international work on this as well. But there was this long-term decline in entry rates, as well as other measures of sort of dynamism, like job reallocation rates, worker flow rates, the share of firms that are small. So we've seen this increase in industrial concentration in the United States. And there's even work on declining rates of migration and other things. And this has been related to things like the pace of labor force growth. It's been related to declining productivity growth in the US in the last couple of decades and so on. So this is this big picture trend, and there's been this big literature about it. And what I'm showing you for the pandemic suggests quite a bit of dynamism just in the last couple of years. So let me show you, just to put into context, what actually happened in the pandemic. So here in the left panel, I'm showing you job creation rate, job destruction rate, and reallocation. What's the job creation rate? That's the total number of jobs created by entering or expanding establishments. Okay, and divide by employment, that's the job creation rate. The job destruction rate is total jobs destroyed by exiting or contracting establishments. And the reallocation rate is the sum of these two things. Okay, so it's the pace at which jobs are reallocating around the economy. So if you look at the black line, the reallocation rate, you see this enormous spike early in the pandemic. And then things sort of come down, although remain a little bit elevated above the immediate pre-pandemic pace. The chart on the right there is the same thing, but for a longer time view. And so you can kind of put this in context relative to the longer term decline. So you see this jump in reallocation, but one important nuance here is that the jump in reallocation we see at the beginning of the pandemic there in that black line spiking, it was not caused by simultaneously increasing job creation and job destruction, which is normally how we think of dynamism. We're not actually hoping for a dynamic economy that's just tons of jobs getting destroyed, so the reallocation rate is high. Rather, you normally think of dynamism as being simultaneous creation and destruction as factors are reallocated to more productive uses. Instead, in that initial jump in reallocation, it's all about a jump in job destruction. And then the following quarter is this big increase in job creation as a lot of temporary layoffs came back to work. And then that continued for a little bit. And so you have to be a little careful thinking about job reallocation in the pandemic. Now, one way we're going to do it is to do, there's some past work by my co-author, John Altwinger and Steve Davis, looking at multi-quarter reallocation, and we'll call it excess reallocation. So if you take reallocation minus net job growth, you get excess reallocation. We can calculate excess reallocation over multiple quarter horizons. And the way we do that is by saying we take the, reallocation is job creation plus destruction. So average job creation over multiple quarters, average job destruction over multiple quarters, and add those up, subtract the net employment growth, and you get excess reallocation over multiple quarters. And I'm showing here a few different horizons at which you can calculate that. And again, the right panel on this slide is the same as the left panel, just with more time. And here you can see excess reallocation, multi-quarter reallocation really surged for quite a while during the pandemic. Okay, so this gets around that problem where creation and destruction are decoupled in time. Here we kind of can smooth through that, and we can see this tremendous surge in reallocation. In the paper, we do some additional analysis where we look at what are the cells across which this reallocation is happening, across geography, industry, firm age bins, firm size bins. And we see that the big increase is moving across firm age bins, often interacted with geography or industry, and firm size bins. So we do see, and that's interesting, we do see elevated reallocation, even when we think really hard about it in this multi-quarter horizon, and when we look what cells the jobs are moving across. Here's one other sort of thing to point to, and I think there's some really interesting stuff here. These are bar charts. I'm looking, so focus on the panel on the top left there. I'm looking at the change in the share of firms or employment that is accounted for by different firm size categories. Okay, and I'm looking at from March of 2020, which is like right at the beginning of the pandemic, and that's our reference period for annual data in the US, March of 2020 to March of 2022. Okay, it's the change in your share of the total. And what we see is that the smallest firm size category, the 1 to 19 category, sees this big increase in its share of firms and employment. You also see a kind of a jump at the top end for the employment share as well. So there's kind of a hollowing out here. But this increase in the small firm share is very, very notable. Now, some of you might be saying, well, look, all the firms got smaller, right? Firms laid off workers and they got smaller, and it's not a good thing to see firms flowing into small size categories. We can actually sort of get at that with BLS data. So the chart on the top right there shows the total change in the level of employment from 2020 to 2022 by size bin. That's the hollow bars. So literally, I look at what was your employment level in March of 2022 minus your employment level in March of 2020. But the green line is this very nice thing that the BLS puts out where they use a dynamic method. And that's where they attribute job growth to the size bin in which it occurred. So if you start at 0 and you move up to 25, 20 of those jobs or 19 of those jobs will be assigned to job growth in the lowest category. And then the remainder will be assigned to the next category up. Okay. This allows us to see if there are flows upward out of small categories, and indeed there are. The green line is bigger than the hollow bar in that first category, and what that means is that there are jobs that are being assigned to that category in the dynamic method, which is where we assign jobs to the bin in which they occurred, but those aren't counting for the level differences, and so that means there's been growth out of the category. Kind of hard to explain, but if you're interested, we try to explain it in the paper. And then the bottom left panel, I'm getting close, Kevin. The bottom left panel is doing the same thing by firm age groups. And here you see this big increase in the number of firms that are very young, less than 1 year old. And so we're seeing these shifts in the firm distribution, including the firm age distribution. One little notable thing, look at the age 5 to 9 category, which sees an increase in its share. Those are young firms that are born prior to the pandemic, and they did really well during the pandemic, which I think is quite notable. Okay, so we do see this dynamism in the pandemic, a shift toward new firms, small firms, lots of reallocation. We want to emphasize, though, first of all, as I mentioned, the pandemic entrants are small. Second, the jump in reallocation, there's an initial big spike, but the pace that we've been at for the last year or two doesn't match the pre-pandemic decline. And then finally, if we really are going to get a reversal of these long-run dynamism trends, we would need a continued surge in entry. It would need to be quite persistent, and we would need robust post-entry growth. So we're simply not there. It's too early to tell whether we're going to have a durable reversal of some of these dynamism trends. Okay, let me wrap up. I just want to first highlight the business formation statistic. This is a relatively new product. This was a tremendous innovation by a US statistical agency that I think we got it just a couple years before the pandemic, and it has really proven its value. So I think this is a big victory for official statistics. It was a new thing that turned out to be one of our most important high frequency indicators in the recession. And then I'll just skip to some final summary comments. I've described for you what happened. We had these two waves of business applications. Starting in 2021, we see this genuine surge in employer business entry. And it looks like potential entrepreneurs saw opportunities from changes in patterns of consumption, work, lifestyle, and business, and they went after those opportunities, as entrepreneurs do. And this surge in entry facilitated or followed broader pandemic economic restructuring across industry and geography. And then there's this quit rate point that I mentioned. And let me just cover this last point here, and then I'll quit. Historically, entry has been an important source of aggregate productivity growth. Now, of course, most entrants sort of do nothing. They stay small or they exit, but a small subset of entrants grow rapidly and make big contributions to innovation and productivity. So you might ask, okay, are we going to see a productivity growth burst because of what's happened in the pandemic here in the US? And it's an open question. Some of you might be thinking, probably not. A lot of this is sort of just reshuffling. We're moving businesses from downtown areas to suburbs where people want them. We're changing what we sell from what people used to want to what people want now. That kind of reshuffling you might think is unlikely to boost productivity. But I do want to highlight that we have this surge in startups in innovation-intensive sectors, professional, scientific, and technical services, and things like that, the information sector. And historically, these sectors have been important for productivity growth. And so that might be an optimistic sign. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks very much, Ryan. That was really amazing. So much data, information, and a good plug for official statistics as well. Over to Tom now from the ONS, Tom Wickersham, and we're going to get a bit of a perspective on UK experience.
Thanks very much. Let me share my slides. Can you see these slides?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So hi, everyone. I'm Tom Wickersham. I'm head of the Economic Microdata Transformation team at the UK's Office for National Statistics. My team are responsible for developing firm level data sets and business microdata statistics using the business survey and administrative data that the ONS has access to. And that includes publishing statistics on business dynamism and developing the UK's own longitudinal business database. Rather than use my discussant role to comment much on Ryan's excellent paper, I thought actually it might be instead to use my time to talk a little bit about the data for UK business dynamism, how it's structured, and then some early findings that we can see in the UK data on business dynamism during the pandemic. So we can start to compare the UK experience to Ryan's picture from the US. And I think it's worth saying, this is always worth doing. I think a lot of the narrative on productivity and dynamism is set by the US because it's got such a strong set of evidence, as Ryan went through, and a good literature. And in many ways, the UK has seen similar trends over the years of declining dynamism and slowing productivity, but there are often some important differences between the UK and the US, which are worth bringing out. So the first thing to note is that the structure of UK business microdata is very different to the US. Ryan helpfully summarized a lot of the US sources in that slide, and in the paper it's a really useful source for looking at that, actually. And a lot of the US sources are based on that establishment level data, which in the UK we might call sites or local units, those physical locations of businesses like a shop or a factory. But in the UK, most business survey and administrative data is instead based at the level of the sort of enterprise or kind of autonomous combination of legal units. And then there are other ways that kind of firm level, which you might define the business, like its reporting unit, which is literally the address the ONS would send a business survey out to, or its associated tax units like VAT, corporation tax, or payroll taxes. So we do capture site level information, which we in the ONS would call local units, but there's less direct data collection at that level. And in the UK, most of the data for business dynamism comes from either Companies House or the Interdepartmental Business Register, which I will talk about in turn. So Companies House is the UK Register of Limited Companies. It covers a wide range of businesses, large and small, but it's worth saying it does not cover the self-employed or businesses that are unincorporated by definition. And just to give a sense of scale here, of the 5.6 million estimated private sector businesses in the UK in 2023, and that includes all these types of businesses from sole proprietor, self-employed people to like big corporations. Of those 5.6 million, 2.1 million were actively trading companies and therefore included in the Companies House data. And of those, 1.1 million were employers. And I think from looking at Ryan's explanation of the data sources, this is probably the most comparable we have to the US business formation stats that Ryan used to look at some of those business applications. Then the other main source of business dynamism data in the UK is the Interdepartmental Business Register. This is a list of UK businesses used by government for statistical purposes. Mainly, it's actually used as a sampling frame for surveys of businesses so that the ONS can draw a representative sample and then mail out all the surveys. The main input sources for the IDBR are value-added tax, VAT, and pay-as-you-earn pay from, which are provided by HMRC, our tax authority. And this means that the businesses which appear on the Interdepartmental Business Register must usually either be registered for VAT, which means they'll have an annual turnover over the VAT registration threshold of £85,000, or they'll pay at least one member of staff through the pay-as-you-earn payroll system. And again, to give a sense of scale, of the 5.6 million estimated private sector businesses in 2023, about 2.6 million were on the IDBR. Or for registered for VAT or pay-as-you-earn. And so there is going to be a big overlap there between Companies House and IDBR, but there you can imagine a sort of Venn diagram of the two where there's non-overlapping coverage. So the IDBR will include some of those self-employed sole traders and partnerships that have chosen not to incorporate as a company, but do use value-added tax or pay-as-you-earn, employ someone, or they are big enough to have turnover over that VAT registration threshold. But the IDBR does not capture companies which aren't employers and which keep their turnover below that VAT registration threshold. So those are the sort of limitations of those two sources. And then a final source that we're developing for the UK is the Longitudinal Business Database, or LBD. And this is based on the Interdepartmental Business Register, which is captured at a quarterly frequency. So every quarter we take a snapshot of the business register, and then we link all those things up to make the LBD. Because the IDBR is primarily a survey sample frame, as I said, the LBD applies activity criteria to make sure it's only capturing the economically active businesses, and that makes it more meaningful for economic analysis. So we're trying to turn that more sort of economic analysis data set. It also links all those businesses longitudinally over time. So you could follow a business through its multiple years that it's on the business register and see how it develops. And it also links up all the different levels of a business, or the ways you might define the business. So all those kind of different references of, the firm, its local units, its sites, its tax units, its company registration number. These things are all in the business register data, but the LBD links all those things up and puts them together in a user-friendly way for researchers. And so that makes it a really useful tool for looking at trends in business dynamism. You can, for example, look at things like, are businesses expanding by opening new sites or growing their existing ones, that sort of thing. And our longitudinal business database is inspired by the US LBD, which has been available for around 20 years, I think, but it does use different input sources. And so because the IDBR is at the moment the sole input source for the longitudinal business database, it kind of inherits many of the strengths and weaknesses of the IDBR for dynamism analysis. But one advantage, I think, at least compared to the US LBD, is that it is relatively timely, because the IDBR is being regularly updated with these live data feeds from HMRC tax data. And just to say, we've recently made the first major version of the longitudinal business database available on the Secure Research Service for UK accredited researchers to access, and published an introductory guide on the ESCoE website. So we're really trying to open this data up to researchers to start using it. Okay, so that's all the kind of data context. Let's start looking at some of the results, some of the measures of business dynamism, and seeing how they compare to what Ryan has presented for the US. So this first chart shows the number of weekly company registrations, which I've extracted from companies' house data using a very useful tool developed by Anthony Savagar, Yanis Galanakis, and Jonathan Hobbs. Put the link in the source there. It's really worth having a look at. The weekly data is clearly very volatile, but you can kind of quite clearly see that before the pandemic, the number of new companies incorporated each week rarely got above 15,000. And then the pandemic hit, which I've highlighted the lockdown periods in pink there. And after an initial decline in incorporations between March and April 2020, right at the start of lockdown, company registrations then spiked in the middle of the year and stayed above 15,000 a week until the end of 2020. And since then, company registrations have remained at that kind of elevated level, similar to what Ryan has observed in the US. Now, I don't think the magnitude of the increase is quite as big as the US. I think the sort of ratio of before to after in Ryan's figures was about 1.5, and this is smaller than that. Although I don't know how fair it is to compare the different measures, given that they are sort of looking at slightly different things. And the other thing to say is that I haven't really had time putting this presentation together to get into the kind of detailed sector analysis, but you can do that. One thing I did have a look at was the online retail sector, or the retail that's not based in physical stores, and noticed that there was a huge increase similar to what Ryan observed in his data around the sort of time of the pandemic, again, that has been sustained since. So if one sector that is very clearly has very clearly sort of gone through that trend is online retail, and I'm not so sure about the other ones. Haven't had a chance to look, but would be worth some further investigation. I think Anthony Savagar in some of his work with his data may have looked at those as well. This chart shows the same measure of incorporations from Companies House, but it's a quarterly frequency, which irons out some of that volatility. And then it also shows company dissolutions or closures, which it's worth noting have also increased relative to those pre-pandemic numbers. And interestingly, there was a large dip in 2020, so a decline in the number of businesses closing during that kind of peak of the pandemic. I'm not entirely sure whether that's due to policy things like furlough schemes supporting businesses, or just a sort of administrative thing of maybe it was difficult for Companies House to sort of process all the dissolutions around that time. But this is an interesting one. It's worth looking at exits if we're thinking about whether this question of whether we're going to see a reversal in that longer term trend of declining business dynamism. Then looking at business exits is really important, as well as the entries. And kind of continuing on that point around firm exit, we could also look at insolvencies data, which is another useful data source. So these are businesses that are unable to pay their debts. First thing to notice is that insolvencies, the number of insolvencies is pretty small relative to the overall number of company dissolutions. But it does tell you something quite useful about broader business conditions And as you can see, the series goes back to 2000, which is quite useful. So you can see that previous jump in insolvencies around the financial crisis. So insolvencies, again, initially were lower during the pandemic between the first quarter of 2020 and the third quarter of 2021. But then they've since increased substantially with similar numbers of quarterly insolvencies to what we saw in the financial crisis. A key question from Ryan's paper then is how many of the newly registered businesses would become more established and they might contribute more significantly to future productivity growth. In the UK, the Interdepartmental Business Register is quite a good proxy for these more established businesses because, as I said earlier, to appear on it, you need to either have turnover of over 85,000 a year, or you need at least one employee on the payroll. And so we have a chart here of the number of quarterly business births and deaths on the business register. And noticeably, compared to the company's house data, the IDBR shows very little change in the early stages of the pandemic. And if anything, there was a slight decline in the number of business births and deaths during 2020. And then the number of business births continues to be fairly flat on the IDBR, right up until the most recent data in the third quarter of 2023. So it doesn't really seem to be that a higher number of incorporating businesses is feeding through into an increase of the births of those more established firms that are registered for VAT or have people on the payroll, or at least not yet. However, there has been an increase in the number of business deaths since early 2022 in this IDBR data, with deaths exceeding births for most of that recent period for the past couple of years. And so finally, on the UK data, here are some entry and exit rates from the longitudinal business database. Because the longitudinal business database is based on the Interdepartmental Business Register, this shows quite similar dynamics to the previous chart that I had up. One difference is that the LBD is a longer time series, so it goes all the way back to 2000, but it's less timely, so then it only runs up in this chart up to the first quarter of 2022. And we're actually about to publish a new bulletin on the 11th of December that will update some of this, so look out for that. The longer time series means we can compare recent changes to the financial crisis, during which the entry rate fell and the exit rate rose. And then following that financial crisis, the exit rate was relatively subdued, which is consistent with that more kind of broadly observed trend of declining business dynamism. And then we can see that recent increase in exit rates, maybe that's a sort of a temporary result of scaling back of things like pandemic business support and the impact of tougher business conditions like higher interest rates. Maybe it'll be more sustained. So maybe this is, this is Ryan's question about whether this is there are signs here of a recovery in business dynamism following that long period of subdued exit rates, in particular for the UK. And then finally, on the sort of data, all the data I've shown so far has been at that level of the enterprise or company. The IDBR does hold information, as I said, on local sites or establishments, those physical locations. And so we can use the LBD to analyze dynamism at a site level, which is kind of more similar to what Ryan showed for establishments. So I've taken this from a presentation my team gave at the ESCoE conference earlier this year, and we'll turn that into an article published next year. Instead of measuring the numbers of site births and deaths, this looks at rates of job creation and destruction associated with those sites. And what it shows is that declining site level business dynamism has been driven by falls in the rate at which existing enterprises are opening or closing sites and increasing or reducing employment at those existing sites. So there's been no change in the contribution of enterprise births and deaths. With the site level dynamism data, we can also start to look at the geography of business dynamism in a way that we haven't been able to do with some of the other UK sources that I've shown you today. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to get into results of that now, but again, look out for that sort of information in a future article. So just to conclude, the UK experienced an increase in the number of company registrations during the pandemic, and that has been sustained, which seems similar to the US, although maybe a bit lower in magnitude and maybe not quite the same in terms of all of the sectors which Ryan highlighted have driven the increase in the US. However, there has been little sign of an increase in the birth rate of those bigger VAT or pay-as-you-earn registered businesses on the business register. Instead, we have seen an increased rate of business deaths and insolvencies since 2021, which remains at a sort of higher rate today. We're going to publish updated business dynamism data on the 11th of December, which will include measures of job creation, job destruction, and job reallocation, as well as the enterprise births and deaths measures. And in my team, we're going to continue developing our longitudinal business database over the coming year. We want to develop a link between Companies House data and the LBD so that we can start to assess to what extent those newly incorporated businesses are growing their turnover and employment. And like I said, just a sort of final plug, we've made that longitudinal business database microdata available in the Secure Research Service. We'd really like to start engaging with users of this data and receive feedback as we develop the data set further. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Tom. Just a reminder to everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A and we'll sort through them as they come flooding in. While we're waiting for that flood, let me just ask Ryan a question. You seem very optimistic, Ryan, about the fact that there was a lot of firms going into industries that were regarded as being rather sources of innovation, high tech, and that boded well for future productivity growth rather than just a reshuffling of economic activity. But there's a long history in looking at firm level data of observing low productivity growth firms exiting industries, but being replaced by firms with even lower productivity growth, because there's a learning by doing thing. It takes a while for the firms to get up to speed and be even as productive as the firms that have just exited. So there could be and that seems to be playing out in the data, that the long run productivity decline in the US seems to be continuing. John Fernald and co-authors have looked at this. It just seems like there's no big burst in productivity we're seeing post-pandemic. It's just the return to the trend that we had beforehand. So, Ryan, do you have any thoughts on that? Is there going to be a sudden burst in productivity? We just have to wait for these little firms to grow bigger, or are we going to see it sooner rather than later?
Yeah, I mean, we can only speculate. So, and that's, we don't know, how much it will matter, if at all. For one thing, the industry detail that I showed that we can look at is not great. I mean, we're looking at a 3-digit industry. That professional, scientific, and technical services sector includes a lot of tech stuff. It also includes like law firms. And so that could be a source of uncertainty. But then, yeah, on this other point, I mean, I think we do think, even innovative, high productivity businesses, they start very small. And, we have other work and other people have done work. There's this firm life cycle where firms, these really high quality firms, grow rapidly for like 5 to 10 years. And so I think we would expect, if indeed there is going to be a productivity effect from this, I think we would expect it to be gradual and to play out over some time.
Thanks, Ryan. Helen, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
So brilliant. So I've been doing some analysis for the UK with Anthony Savaga and other co-authors who've been mentioned, trying to look into the cause of this increase in small-scale startups. And we've also looked at sort of people using individual data, whether people have took on a second self-employment job during the pandemic. And what it looks like in the UK is that the furlough scheme that we had, which essentially paid people 80% of their salary who were unable to work and then required them to essentially work 0 hours, played a role. So they had a sort of guaranteed income and they had a lot of time. And so we think what our evidence suggests is that these people were sort of able to experiment a little bit with setting up their own business, online business, or what I believe is now called a side hustle. So I was wondering, whether there was something similar in the States which might have allowed those people who couldn't work from home to do something similar.
Yeah, it's a good question. We did have just this huge range of fiscal programs, many of which could have influenced this kind of activity. There's not exactly what you're asking, but there is a little bit of evidence. There's a paper by Jun-Kyu Choi and co-authors finding some evidence that our unemployment insurance system may have boosted business applications. So they look across US states where there's a fair amount of variability in how the unemployment insurance payments went out. And they find that there's this sort of positive relationship between applications and unemployment insurance. So that might have played some role. There were these large checks sent to households. 3 different series of checks went out to households, and the income cutoff for those was very, very high. I think it was something like $200,000 a year income. If you were below that, you'd get some check. So there was lots of cash that went out. And there's a paper by Jorge Guzman and Scott Stern and co-authors from 2021, where they just look at the time series in business registrations, and they see this jump in business registrations every time checks go out. So that could be playing a role as well. And then additionally, just sort of the broader huge amount of demand stimulus that was just washing around out there could have provided incentives just by sort of being support for revenue. So I don't think that's quite what you're asking, because I don't think I can quite answer your question, but this fiscal stuff does seem to have mattered. We really wish we could study what we call non-employers. So I think these side hustles you're talking about would be non-employers. We do not have good high frequency, timely data on non-employer businesses in the United States. We do have the application series where we can sort of guess, and it turns out I showed the likely non-employer series, which is this residual, all the applications that aren't categorized as likely employers. I mean, that really, really surged in the pandemic. We show in the paper in the appendix that is quite predictive of non-employer business formation, which, as I said, could include side hustles. So I suspect that did go up in the pandemic, but we can't tell yet. We don't have nearly as good of data on actual non-employer business activity as we have on employers. And then the last point I'll make, which is also a little tangential, but maybe helpful, we do have measures of multiple job holding in the US from our household labor market survey. Multiple job holding actually dropped in the pandemic, at least as measured in that survey. It has sort of recovered. It's now sort of close to where it was prior to the pandemic, but we didn't see an increase in measured multiple job holding, which of course is a hard thing to measure. But that's best we can tell from the data. That particular thing didn't rise.
Thank you.
I hope that's helpful. I know that's not quite what you're asking, but hopefully that provides some context.
Yeah, it's very helpful, and the references too. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. And I think your co-author now, Anthony, would like to ask a question. So Anthony, could you unmute and ask your question?
Hopefully you can you can hear me.
Yes.
Mike, it was really interesting. Thanks very much, Ryan. And as you know, we've done some similar stuff in the UK with Sophie Petal and Salim Bahaj, and find some similarities to what you find in the US, which is in some ways reassuring. But my question was really a semantic one. So when you have the BFS, what does it mean to become an employer? Is that when a director then sort of recruits someone and has an employee? And then how does that compare to what an employer would be in the business birth stuff? Could a sole director firm be count as an employee firm, or do they have to go out and actually recruit someone?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in the BFS itself, the actual applications, we don't actually know anything about whether they're actually an employer or not. You just they might indicate whether they plan to hire people. The likely employer series that I was showing is just based on, here are applications that fall in one of the bins that tends to predict actual employer entry, and those are based on industry and legal form and some other things. So in the BFS itself, it's not really it's not actually measuring employer firms. But I think, and maybe what you might be hinting at here is the BFS does publish these actual transitions that come from the other business microdata. And so in the actual employer firm birth transitions within 4 or 8 quarters series, to show up in that, you have to hire former employees. if you're a sole proprietor and you're not issuing a paycheck to yourself, you will not count as an employer business, either in the BFS or in like the BED where I was talking about. You have to be showing up in these sort of employee payment government databases to actually count as an employer business. And those vary a little bit by stat agency, but like for the BLS, you've got to be in the unemployment insurance system. And so if I'm just out there on my own selling services but not issuing a paycheck to myself, I'm not going to be filing with unemployment insurance system, and so I won't appear in those data. And then on the Census Bureau side, there's sort of a similar thing. I think it has to do with Social Security Administration data and tax authority data. And so if you're, as you call it, like if you're a director but you haven't hired anyone and you're just sort of like living off the profits of the business, you will not be an employer business in any of these data sets until you issue yourself a paycheck or hire some additional people that you will issue a paycheck. That's when you'll show up.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Ryan. We're out of time, folks. Not everyone got their question asked and answered, but feel free, I'm sure, to email Ryan or Tom if you've got any further questions. So finally, thanks very much, Ryan. Thank you, Tom. That was a great session. And more great webinars to come in this series. So thanks very much, everyone, for attending, and see you next time.